meeting is recorded, so I just started recording, and it will be made available on our website after the meeting is over. So again, it is November 5th, it's 3 p.m., the fourth meeting of the UPSFF Working Group. Before I kick it over to Kevin and Lindsay, I am going to take roll call, and I am going to start with, we'll go in alphabetical order again. Michael Bayek from DC Public Charter School Board.
I'm here.
Great, thank you. Just everyone make sure you're muted. Okay, thanks. If you're not speaking, just make sure you're muted. But Vanessa Carlo Miranda from E.L. Haynes.
I'm here.
Great. Ken Cherry from Friendship Public Charter School.
I think he's going to be a little late, Ryan.
Okay. Chelsea Coffin from DC Policy Center.
Yes, I'm here.
Great. Jen Comey from Deputy Mayor for Education.
Here.
Justin Ellis from KIPP DC Public Charter School.
Here.
Jeanette Fernandez from the Office of Budget and Performance Management.
Hi, I'm here.
Great. And let's see. So from DCPS, is anybody, Elba Garcia from DCPS?
Yes, I'm here.
And Elba, do you know if anybody else from DCPS will be attending today?
Yes, I think Jessica Swanson will be attending as well.
Okay, great.
They might be running a little late from another meeting.
Okay, so I'm going to skip the other people from DCPS for now. Shannon Hodge from the DC Charter School Alliance. Okay, she's not here. Kubila Huddleston said she would not be able to make it today. Shelley Hughes from EdOps said that she would be running late today, but she'll be on later. Mary Levy.
I'm here.
Hi, Mary. Just to let you know, your microphone is kind of feedbacky.
Okay, the problem is I have a webcam and my application doesn't give me the option to use the webcam system instead of the computer system. And I don't know how to do that.
Got it. So it's not so bad right now, but just make sure you're on mute whenever you're not speaking, okay?
Right.
Great. Jack McCarthy from Apple Tree Public Charter School.
I am here.
Great. Alonzo Montalvo from the Office of the Chief Financial Officer.
I'm here.
Great. Thanks, Alonzo. Kathy Riley from TC Shape.
I'm here. Thank you.
Great. Skipping over some DCPS people. Raymond Whedon from Thurgood Marshall Academy Public Charter School.
Here.
Great. And Jonathan Weinstein from Capital City Public Charter School.
Here. Thanks.
Great. Okay. Thank you. So real quick, just some rules or whatever. Again, make sure you're on mute if you're not talking. There's also members from the public that are on this call, and members of the public, you guys are all muted for the duration of the meeting. We will have 3 opportunities for public comment, and when we open up the floor for public comment, you can use the raise your hand feature, and then I can unmute you, and then you can share your thoughts on what we've been discussing. And I think I covered all the ground rules, Kevin. I will kick it over to you now.
Great, thanks Ryan, and good afternoon everybody. Good to see everyone. Once again, my name is Kevin Wenzel. I'm the Director of Performance Management for the Office of the Deputy Mayor for Education. And as Ryan mentioned, we're here for the 4th meeting of the UPSFF Working Group, which is convened by OSSI. We have folks from DCPS, public charter schools, and the public. And our goal here is to provide input and recommendations regarding revisions to the formula. This is the November meeting. We'll also meet in December. We'll talk a little bit about scheduling toward the end of our time today. Ryan did a bunch of the housekeeping already. I think I'll also just note that while I'll be presenting, my colleague Lindsay Malik-Mayhew will be moving around the presentation. So we have a lot of content to cover today. So thanks, Lindsay, for helping me out with that. And as Ryan mentioned too, just please make sure that you're silenced while we're going through, but also working group members are welcome to unmute and ask questions in sort of natural pauses for Q&A, but just use your discretion throughout as we go through that. We'll get to I'll note the public comment periods once we've finished up with the majority of the content. And today the primary focus is going to be on the foundation level cost drivers chapter of the 2020 UPSFF study. Although we do have other agenda items, so I'll just go through those quickly in order. First, we're going to return to the English language learner options. This was the topic of conversation in the October meeting, and since then, we had working group members complete a temperature check survey to see how you're feeling about each of the options, hopefully with the goal of driving toward a recommendation for the next meeting. Next, as I mentioned, we'll look at the foundation level cost driver analysis, which is the final chapter of the study that we'll look at as a working group together. And then finally, we have a set of draft recommendations from the inputs that we've received on at-risk student need and at-risk concentration. So we'll go through, take a look at what the language looks like there, and facilitate kind of a guided session to work through where we will land for recommendations from the working group to come out of this 2020 version of this group. So Lindsay, I think since we have a ton of stuff to go over, I think if we could go over to the survey results deck. And I'll just remind everybody that the scope of this survey was the English language learner options that we covered last time. So we did at-risk and covered at-risk concentration in the last deck that looked like this. This deck will look very similar. Lindsay, if you'll go to slide 2. Great, thank you. So again, this should look similar to the deck that we covered on at-risk. It was the same kind of format where we both asked you to take a look at the options and either agree or disagree on a scale just at looking at the option. And then in a second, we'll take a look at the rankings that folks did, which is ranking the options against each other. As I take a look at this deck, I think the patterns that are very clear to me is that most popular in terms of these top two, strongly agree, somewhat agree. Most popular are these last two options, either additional funding for students that are, quote, new to country designation, or additional funding for students identified that as being of limited or interrupted formal education, which we abbreviate as SLIFE. So both of those garnered about 9 out of the 11 folks that completed the survey as on some scale of agree. On the opposite end, the other pattern that stuck out to me is that these options that are in the middle, the proficiency options, in which funding would be targeted towards students based on their proficiency scores on WIDA, which is the English proficiency test, were the least popular. So we had folks that were most either somewhat disagree or strongly disagree for those two options, either just straight up proficiency or combination of grade levels and proficiency. Yes, Kathy, I think I hear you.
Yeah, I would just be curious to hear some reasoning why. I mean, I understand. I don't know how many students are in those, F and G, the last two categories that were popular, but why is there so much feeling against funding, to people that are at the lowest, like the WIDA test or, aligning it to proficiency? Why is it so strongly disagreed with? Because the ELL principals and people that I talked to thought that was actually very important. I didn't understand why that was so strongly disagreed.
Yeah, I would open it to the group on that. I think one thing that we saw for two things, Kathy, that you just mentioned, the last two groups, I think are pretty highly correlated with students that would be of low English proficiency. So there may be a more targeted way of reaching them, and that's why folks answered that way. And I think also the other kind of limitation with the proficiency as it was presented in the study was we don't right now have an explicit proficiency tie for funding elsewhere in the UPSFF, and I think that it's just challenging to implement. But I would also open to other folks that somewhat disagreed or disagreed strongly with those options.
I guess I'd also, maybe as we talk about this, if we get to the end of it, is how many students are we talking to? Like, how many are we missing by not looking at the WIDA test scores or in any way considering proficiency? Like, we're assuming that those are our biggest groups, new to country and SLIFE, you know, that we're getting the ones that we're getting the proficiency target there. But can we make that assumption? I mean, I just don't want to miss, you know, this has been a long time coming to make an adjustment to the ELL funding, if we know that it's not adequate. And I'm worried that this isn't enough, the way that we've done this by not doing anything that with proficiency.
Yeah, I think two things in there, Kathy. The first is these last two groups, new to country and SLIFE, are actually very small. I think, Lindsay, I actually don't want to jump over to the deck, but this information is in the UPSFF study deck. I think it's like 150 students were new to country and something like 100 were SLIFE. Like, this is a very small subset of these groups. And the only other thing I'll mention about proficiency is that what the study performance-wise showed was that proficiency was pretty highly correlated with the grade bands, and that we know that within the grade bands there was difference based on your proficiency level. So it wouldn't be that we wouldn't be considering proficiency at all if we were to do something like grade bands. It just wouldn't be as explicit as tying a test score into the formula.
But we have so much disagreement on that. That's why I'm sort of
That's right.
why I'm out here, and I don't feel like an expert on this. So I went to the principals and the teachers that I know that teach these students, and I think they would feel really let down by us only fixing ELL by serving maybe 300 or 400 more students in the whole system with any additional funding. So I'm worried about this. And if Elba wants to speak to it, or anybody that's more immersed in it, why, you know, I understand that you might have put in a priority in the other ones, but people disagree with it. So I don't get it. That's my question.
I have an answer to the question about how many students. The lowest WIDA scores would target 2,356 students. A new to country category would be 947 students, and SLIFE would be 154, but that is DCPS only. That doesn't include the charter LEAs.
So yeah, that gives a sense of the relative size, I guess.
And Kathy, I'm trying to understand your question. Because I don't think what I heard you saying is that we don't want to miss anybody, but we're still not missing anybody. We're counting all L's and getting funding for all L's. We're just differentiating a specific group of students that need more support than others. So I'm not sure that we're saying the same thing. That's
Yes,
why.
I understand that. I have felt the desire in the ELL community for more funding. So I mean, that is interesting that it's almost 1,000 students that are new to country.
More funding for students that are new to country, more funding based.
Yeah. Do you feel like do you feel like in what you look in terms of the programs, do you feel they basically have enough funding, but we just don't quite fund enough to new to country and SLIFE? Is that your assessment?
In my perspective, yeah, in my perspective, the schools, when we budget, you know, the 22-to-1, whatever is it that we do, I feel like schools tend to use all funding for supporting the students with the lowest proficiency levels, and actually they do need support, but the 3s and 4s need extra support to get over the hump and exit. I think when we talked about funding them by level, I was very strong about the need to fund them by level 1, 2, 3s, and 4. So I'm kind of with you on that sense, but I also feel that there's a need to specifically target kids that are SLIFE because their needs are so much more deeper than just if you were a certain level. I mean, the premise with ELLs is that the students move throughout the levels. So the funding, you know, kind of like diminishes and moves. But what I am not too sure is I thought that this was just a preliminary of how people felt, right? That this is just like a temperature check. It's not that we have ruled it out completely. It's just how people feel at the time that they completed this. Am I correct, Kevin?
That's right. That's what it was intended as.
So we still haven't ruled not doing it by levels, but I think there is still that intention to look at it by levels, by grade levels, to see what makes the better sense, to add those two categories that we have looked at this life, and the high risk, right? So all of it is still pending. We haven't made any final decisions, right?
Right, except that with this many somewhat disagree. I'm just curious, are people moving
from the folks? Yeah, we would need to hear from the ones that somewhere disagree, right? Because we want to know why the disagreement. Like, what is the understanding or lack of understanding to go that way?
Right.
Okay. So do we have any takers that you felt that way and share why?
Hi, this is Jeanette. Can you hear me?
Yep, go for it, Jeanette.
Sorry, weirdly I had to join on my cell phone.
I saw you're here twice.
Yes. I wanted to join 2 times. No, I think that I know for the first option, the proficiency targeting towards the lowest test score. For me personally, I didn't agree with this primarily because it wasn't paired with a grade level. And I think that low proficiency in, K to 5 is much easier to surmount than a low proficiency at 9th grade, 10th grade, and 11th grade, where the student is also trying to gain skills in, really complicated subjects like algebra. So that's the first one. And then on the combination of grade levels and proficiency, I definitely agree with this, but I think that my hesitation here, which is why I think I put somewhat, I can't remember though now because I filled it out such a long time ago, is that it makes the actual shell or the formula so much more complicated for a marginal benefit, in the sense that I don't think, we can make this extremely complex, method of delivering money, but then schools and LEAs are still going to do with it what they, kind of what they want, if that makes sense. So that was kind of my rationale, if that helps.
Thanks, Jeanette.
I understand. I just like to keep it open, that if it's the complexity that we look at it, that this is a temperature check. And I know you don't want to spend the whole meeting on this, but I think we might need to play with it a little more to see if we're actually getting where we want to get. If it's just
agreed. Yes. Yeah, and I think that that's exactly right. What Elvis said. Like we put it out here, which is exactly what we wanted to do, to see where folks were, to sort of generate the conversation. And I think that this has already been a really helpful and productive one so far. I think the one set of recommendations that we haven't talked about as a group yet today are the grade level splits, which of course there were 3 different options here. And I'd love to hear from folks what the pros and cons of each were. These all they were somewhere in between. It seemed like folks disagreed for the most part with proficiency, agreed for the most part with a new designation in the formula for SLIFE or new to country. And this grade level split, which I think would be easiest to implement, was the one that was sort of in the middle. So I'd love to hear some more qualitative feedback on that from folks that filled out the survey, or just as you're looking at the results here today.
I'll do that as well. I think that I don't have as much experience as you all as working with students, but the experience that I did have is from high school specifically, which is why I went very much in the agree for PK to 8 and then high school being different. I just felt like there was so many more challenging subjects that the students were also being asked to excel and be proficient at, that it felt like such a big hurdle for students with limited English proficiency, which is why I tended away from the elementary, middle breakout.
Kevin, can I piggyback on that? This is Jen.
Yep, go for it.
Yeah, I also agree with Jeanette that when I look at them, I also lean towards the K-8 and then high school distinction, particularly because of the study's findings on secondary L students, high school L students having such greater challenges and more outcomes. So for me, that made sense from what we saw in the data and with how it could be implemented in the budget budget.
This is Vanessa. I have a question. From the information that the study did, I think there's a larger question that was raised earlier, which is, do we believe that the current funding is adequate just for our general EL population? And I don't think we've answered that question, or have we?
I don't think so. And I think that's an important point, Vanessa, that similar to the at-risk conversation, AFTA didn't put forward this is the number target that you should hit. So it's sort of up to this group to determine or make recommendations in that way as well.
Because I think there's a couple of things that I see that's happening. On one hand, we have this sort of larger question about what is the cost of having a robust and successful EL program for the students in the District of Columbia. And I think, you know, of all the different areas that we can focus when it comes to money and education, you know, I certainly know that based on the data that we have and knowing some of the limitations that Acton had to work with as it pertains to charter schools, I certainly trust some of the data that's coming from UCPS in terms of their model, what their costs are, and how they're managing that. And so to me, that should be our point of departure, right? It's you know, traditionally the EL weight has been very low, period. And I know we need more quantifiable data to determine by how much. But that was the whole point of the study with Afton. That was what they were supposed to be looking at. And so to get to this question about, like, are we adequately funding EL? And do we still need to do more for the lowest performing students or for the students that require more resources in order to help them get over the hump, whether that's based on age group and grade level, whether that's based on the country or some of these other factors. So to me, I feel like we're jumping to the second part of the conversation, but we've skipped over the first part of the conversation, which is EL weights haven't significantly moved in a really, really long time. We even talked about the why, right? Like, there isn't a strong advocacy. There's not a ton of lawsuits. There isn't like these huge drivers of people pounding their fists and demanding more funding for EL students other than the folks around this table. And so to me, I just don't, by going straight to this sort of conversation around, do we want to put more money in these categories? We seem to have completely overlooked the basic question, which is our starting point for EL even anywhere near adequate for our EL students in the District of Columbia? And I think the performance data, the goal of looking at performance data was to help answer that question.
That's right.
Yeah, to add a quick thought. I'm sorry I missed the first couple of minutes of the meeting. I'm not sure, Vanessa, what you meant by our data are inaccurate. I think you're seeing a lot more data from DCPS here. You've got 4 charter schools that responded to this data set. So I think that's a little misleading.
Yeah, I said the opposite. It's more.
Okay, gotcha. I must have misheard you.
Because of what you just said. Yeah, it's more.
Yeah, I think, thank you. I think, yeah, because I think our data is pretty rich on this piece. The other thing I want to just raise up again, I think we talked about this on the at-risk side. I still continue to have challenges with making proficiency a reason for funding, because it could create perverse incentives for folks to keep proficiency low. So as with at risk, I don't think this is the right approach. Not that anybody should ever want to do that, but it could create incentives to keep proficiency low.
Yep. Good point. Okay, I think I do just want to cover one other slide in this deck, which is the rankings. So Lindsay, if you'll go to the next slide, slide 3. And we're going to see a similar pattern here. With the highest rankings were the new to country and SLIFE, with the lowest rankings in the proficiency ones, several 6s and 7s there. Again, a similar pattern. And then somewhere in the middle, sort of all over, the grade level splits there as well. Challenging to look at this data because just the way that it's arrayed, but if you tend to think of it as like a top 3 or top 2 or 3 here and sum those up, it gives you a better idea about where folks were looking. But again, similar pattern to what we saw with the agree and disagree scale immediately before. And I think one note in here too, the study mentions, but I think that we should also acknowledge, and I appreciate Jessica bringing up the note about proficiency. I think too, we are just limited in the data that we have for new to country and SLIFE. Like right now, that's not in the funding formula. So there would be the challenge of both defining those and making sure that we're collecting it widely, accurately, that we have a process for that if we were to put it in the formula. So that's one limitation there too. And then Lindsay, can you go to slide 4? I think this will be the least surprising thing that we talk about today, which is that folks really prefer incremental funding if we're going to implement any of the changes relative to our redistributed funding. I know we've talked both on the at-risk deck. Also, I think we see evidence here that the group wants to think about all of these things in a big picture. So hopefully today, after we go through some of the foundation level cost drivers information, we'll have more of a full picture before we can start to talk about which of these we prefer, whether it be whether there are situations where redistribution is appropriate or not, or if we should only implement if incremental funding is available. And then final slide, Lindsay, slide 5. So even though we do see that split, there are several folks that responded to the survey that did strongly agree with redistributed funding, but as you can see, they also are more polarized in that one as well. Several folks that really strongly disagree with that too. So headline here is that incremental funding is preferred by the group, which I think was also true for at-risk. And I think I heard someone unmute if you have something to say. Oh, Jen, come here.
Hi. Can I just go back to something that you said on the slide earlier about SLIFE and how to collect that data and how that would work? I can't help but go to some practicalities as I get to work some with the budget and with projections. And so I'm curious to hear folks' reactions about LEAs having to both submit projections about this if this were to be something to be implemented and it to be tracked in some systematic way. I guess this would have to be part of the audit if this is part of the budgeting process. Like, I'd actually like to hear folks' reactions. It sounds complicated to me, but I'd be curious to hear what other folks' reactions are.
Yeah, Lindsay, if you can go back to slide 3 while folks are pondering Jen's question.
And I feel like I would have to ask the people at that level. Like for me, I would ask some of the people at those schools that have a large number of those students, what do they think they would expect? Would it be part of the enrollment data you fit out? Would that violate their privacy, or what would we? I don't know the answer to those questions, but I think those are important questions for us to have. So how do we get the data that we have on it? That we had 900 and some students that were new to country. How do we know that?
And Ryan, I talked about this a little bit beforehand, but I think that OSSI does collect that information, but for limited reporting purposes. It's not collected for payment purposes, right? So, which I think is another layer of scrutiny with enrollment audits and those kinds of things, which I think is what Jen is bringing up too. So, and the SLIFE one was only from DCPS data. I don't think that's consistently measured across the charter sector.
So when OSSI collects the data, is it just in the stuff that students fill out when they register, or so that it is collected, it is manageable? It would just be somebody has to do it?
I don't think that I could answer that. I think maybe someone from an LEA would have to, like how OSSI's collecting the data, but I know that we're doing it there's some federal reporting that we have to do. And I'm also hesitant because I know we released a policy about sharing that information because it is sensitive, because it's sensitive for the students and the families.
Yes, absolutely.
Right. So that's a flag overall, besides the challenge of whether it's self-reported when a student enrolls or so forth, but what that means to then start having some sort of public tracking that sort of publicly.
So it kind of argues for Vanessa's point that we figure out do we look at how much money we should be spending on these students and not target it so much, but give more money? I don't know. I guess we're going to have to go back to this.
Yeah, I think, Kathy, it's an important point because I think the idea here too is, there is this trade-off between being focused and the amount in the pot. If you have it spread more broadly, I think this is something we saw in at risk too. If there's a limited amount and you do it in a bigger group, then each marginal amount that each student would get would be small relative to targeting it more focused in on a smaller group. So I think that is certainly a trade that we see in both of these considerations too.
And Mary has a lot of interesting things to say in the chat to this point. I think she's afraid about her microphone.
Kevin, if I can chime in from the DCEPS perspective.
Yes, please.
So at the Welcome Center, we have a very comprehensive way of interviewing and working with the families to not only get the information about their current language proficiency level, but also a comprehensive around where they have been in school so that we can determine their if they are indeed interrupted schooling. So it's almost like a package. We ask them a subset of questions. They're all optional. They can share or not share. But if they do share with us where they have not been in school for a certain amount of time, or they've been traveling, or they've been wherever they've been, we tag them as SLAF by our definition. And also the new to the country, we ask them just because that is one of the ways that we determine if the students can be exempt from any of the standardized assessments for a year. So it is a question that we ask. We tell them why we're asking it to see, and then once we collect that data, we have it. So therefore, you do have information from DCPS of who is new to the country and who is attending our schools that have had interrupted formal education, because we ask it through these Welcome Center process that may be unique to DCPS, because we do have a center just dedicated to that. I don't know that charters actually follow the same process. It will be something that I agree with Jen, that if we are going to start collecting the data, we need to come with some sort of uniform way of collecting it so that is equally available and able to be recorded by all LEAs involved.
Got it. Thanks, Elba. Ryan, I do, excuse me, we are a little bit over time relative to what I was hoping to spend on this today, but the conversation's been great. I do want to open for public comment for at least a few minutes if anybody that's out in the public would like to share their thoughts on what we've discussed today.
Sure, so we'll open up to public comment. If there's anybody that wanted to make any comments about what we've discussed, if you use the raise your hand feature, then I will know to unmute you. And so I'll give you a second to do that. Also,
and while we're waiting, yep, go ahead.
Sorry, just real quick. Public comment, public members, you could also send me a chat message if you want to, if you send it to the host. And just for everybody, when you're sending messages in the chat, make sure it goes to everyone and not a specific person, and not just to like all attendees or all panelists. I should have brought that up in the beginning. And I don't see anybody raising their hand at the moment, Kevin.
Got it. Thanks, Ryan. Yeah, one thing I do want to acknowledge to Vanessa's point and to some of the conversation we've had is that in the last working group, we covered the adequacy study, and specifically we talked about whether the weights were keeping pace with what the adequacy study had recommended for the weights. So there is information about the kind of adequacy level for L. And I can't remember exactly how far behind it was the target, but it was behind the target as demonstrated in that 2018 group. So that information is out there, and that is something that we could also consider in this group.
Thank you for acknowledging that. Kevin, I just, my fear, if I may name it, is that we need to move quickly in this space, and we go from a meeting to like a recommendation that you guys draft. And I just feel like the way these surveys are being crafted is sort of leading us into a particular conversation. I think that we, at some point, we need to have a conversation about where are we in terms of what the adequacy study said, and where we are with EL, and where we are in terms of these sort of recommendations that have sort of surfaced to the top, because I don't want to create a false prioritization exercise I think we need to figure a way where we are in terms of like, are we basically going back and saying EL weight levels are just too low, they're not adequate, that's the priority. And then in addition to that, we're saying we have this additional challenge with students that need additional resources. And I just feel like these conversations are not quite getting us there.
Yeah, that is a great point. And I think when we talk about the scoping of what an L recommendation would be, I think that kind of understanding of like, we're not even ready to have this conversation about this set of options, perfectly valid way for the working group to frame what the recommendation would be. And so we certainly take that into consideration in drafting, but also we should talk about it as we're going through the crafting process. So yes, totally agree. Kathy, I think I heard you. I'm not sure.
No, I'm good.
Great. Okay, so thank you everyone for your input so far on this. I think next steps for L is going to be taking a look back at the video once we run it back and trying to, again, in our last couple meetings together, get to a place of recommendation that everyone feels good about. So that'll be what we will revisit next time. Any final words about L before we move into the foundation level study? Okay, great. We are not too far off time, so we are getting back on track, which is great. I think what I want to acknowledge about this chapter of the study, first, I've mentioned already, this is the last chapter that we'll go through together as a group. We've now already gone through at-risk student need, at-risk concentration, and the English language learner part of the study. This is a totally new kind of chapter relative to the other chapters. So we won't necessarily see the same kinds of option slides that we've been used to, the cost analyses that we've been used to in the other chapters. This is a different way of looking at things. And it is also, as has been acknowledged a couple times, even though we haven't gone over this chapter yet, this is retrospective in nature. The chapters were also looking back, but this in particular, because it's about costs, you'll see it only goes up to fiscal year 19. I do want to acknowledge that we are in a different economic context, certainly now, and obviously in a pandemic context, that's something that we should consider. I want to just name that the working group is welcome to, as we had this conversation and we're trying to couch these contextually into our current situation. I think it's important for us to consider this as a piece of work that is going to live in the time itself, but also that's going to live in materials that we will share in the future as well. So something I do want to spend time on today is going through what the cost study found, but I also do want to make sure we'll go through it a little bit faster than we normally would, just because I want to make sure that we leave enough time for the working group to have a robust conversation about the costs that you're experiencing now and the costs looking forward that you plan on or anticipate having to cover, whether due to just a specific context of the pandemic or whether just things that you're seeing trends in your own LEAs or in your own context as well. So plenty of analysis and information in this chapter. We're not going to cover all of it today. We'll mostly cover highlights. But I think that we'll have a good conversation starter in order to get to a recommendation place for this eventually as well. So Lindsay, if you'll go down to slide 3. And just as a level set, I think most folks on this call would know what the foundation level is, but this is that number that flows through the entire formula. And often when you hear the headlines during budget season about the increase to the UPSFF, typically what folks are talking about is the increase from one foundation level to the following year's foundation level. So it's not an indication of the total amount that flows all the way through the formula. It's just that kind of base amount, which is also sometimes referred to, that flows against the weights for student characteristics. Slide 4. So as mentioned, it flows through the formula's weights to determine these per pupil allocations. We then take the enrollment or projected enrollment. We receive a total allocation by LEA. And LEAs, of course, use this funding to cover all sorts of costs. What we're going to look at today is expenditure information from DCPS and then a subset of charter LEAs. But with that said, I do want to also level set that this expenditure analysis is not only on local dollars or only UPSFF dollars. It does come from all sources. And I'll also just note, as mentioned, this is not every single charter's expenditure information. We had a subset of 4 charter LEAs that participated and got all the way through the process, where we were doing some or able to do some apples to apples comparison. So what that means is, while this will be comprehensive on the DCPS side, it'll be more directional than we think, broadly representational on the charter side, but certainly less comprehensive than what we have for DCPS. So something to keep in mind as we're going through the different slides. Slide 5, Lindsay. So we'll spend a little bit of time on these, which are more or less the rolled up headlines from all of the analysis that comes below. We'll look at it a little more graphically in just a second. But I do just want to point out some of the big findings from the study from the subset of LEAs that we did or were able to take a look at. So this first headline, and the way also to think structurally about this, is that we looked at it from the city level, and then we looked at any meaningful differences between DCPS as the buy rate system and the public charters as another subset. So one thing in here first that we find is that, just as one headline, we spend about just under 22.5 per pupil in fiscal year 19. DCPS spending a little bit less than the charter side, but a lot of that is made up in just this facilities allotment, which of course is dollars that DCPS does not receive through the UPSFF, but that charters do receive through the UPSFF. On the growth in spending, this bullet 2, we have a similar CAGR, or compound annual growth rate, for both of the sectors. From the city perspective, it's about 4.1% per year. And these, of course, I think it wouldn't be surprising to anyone on this call. The cost drivers are typically personnel, given the large size of personnel that it takes up in your budgets. And the one meaningful difference that we also feel that we need to acknowledge is that while DCPS, the vast majority of the employees in DCPS are in a union with a collective bargaining agreement, that's not necessarily true on the charter side for the vast majority of charters. Move to slide 6. Last 2 big headlines here, bullet 3. We took a look at the mix of personnel and non-personnel spending, both at the city level, where we see about a 75 personnel, 25 non-personnel split. That's a little bit different when you drill a little bit deeper down into the DCPS side, which spends about 80% on personnel, whereas the charters that we studied spend about 70% on personnel. But across both sectors, what we see, and we'll take a look at this graphically in a moment, about the same amount is spent on classroom teachers in terms of the percentage of total personnel expenditures. And we see that the teacher costs are rising at a similar rate across both DCPS and public charter schools as well. And on the average teacher salary side, for LEAs included in the study, average teacher salary from the city perspective went from about 70 to just about 80K from 16 to 19, with more spending on the DCPS side, where there is a collective bargaining agreement, than on the charter side. But again, the second sub-bullet, the costs, the average teacher costs are increasing about the same on the DCPS and charter side when you look at the CAGR.
I have a quick question about that bullet, Kevin. Can you remind us,
Yep.
This has been a minute since we've seen this.
Mm-hmm.
Is that straight salaries, or does that include benefits?
It's just base salary. Yep, good question. All right, slide 6, 7. Yeah, great. So I just want to also acknowledge there's a big part of this study that we asked Afton to look at that focuses on DCPS schools that have specific programs like IB, school enrichment models, CTE. We're just not going to have time to cover that today. There is some interesting information in there for anyone that wants to dive in deeper. But it was only DCPS schools that we looked at for that. So all that information is toward the end of this chapter of the deck. We won't be able to cover it today, but I did want to acknowledge that it's a big part of the study. We'll go to slide 8. So slide 8 is most similar to the options slides that we've seen in the at-risk and L chapters that we've reviewed before, although of course it looks different because this isn't necessarily viewed as like the city could do this or this or this, option A, B, or C. I think instead what this is acknowledging is that when you have cost drivers in a system, you can either address the cost drivers by just covering it with whatever allocation you're going to provide. You could otherwise increase the allocation by a predictable rate, which is something that we've talked about in this group in the 2018 version. That's what that bullet point 3 is talking about. Sometimes we refer to that as a COLA, which would be just like you would increase by the same amount each year, regardless of whatever kind of rise in costs you see. When we previously talked about this in this group, we acknowledge that it's very difficult to both find a measure of either inflation or something else that both takes DC costs into account, but also takes education costs into account. So it's a little tricky to figure out what the right kind of COLA would be here, but that is also a different option. And then finally, just as an idea about what the cost drivers are, we know that the personnel is a big cost driver. So understanding the impact of how personnel costs increase is important to the city. Understanding the different mix of how different LEAs provide service in-house or out-of-house is important to the city to understand. Understanding how small or underutilized buildings are a cost driver. And then finally, this last point, 2D, that's the consideration that if you're spending money on the facilities allotment, those are other dollars that could otherwise be going toward instruction. So how can we make sure that we're maximizing our instructional component for the dollars that go through the system? I know someone's unmuted, so I'm going to turn it over.
Kevin, it's Kathy again.
Go ahead, Kathy.
I feel like there's a lot of assumptions built in here that, you know, we talked about the difference between having a bargaining unit and not, but we never, the whole study doesn't step back and look at what's the cost of opening up new schools every year when we have unused capacity. And we don't talk about that we have a whole different financial system that, you know, we can talk about DCPS has access to capital dollars, but in the charter sector, we have a huge variation. Some charters have enormous assets banked and others don't have any. So there's so many things that we're not looking at when we look at this that it makes me uncomfortable. And I think with these cost drivers, for us not to look at the largest cost driver of our decision to have unlimited supply of schools. We as a city have decided to have an unlimited supply. And so I'd be curious, you know, as I see in the chat, the capital budget, I understand that thought there. We don't talk about assets and we don't talk about the larger decision we've made to have unlimited supply when we don't have unlimited demand, in fact, because that's why we have so much unused. And also the other thing I want to say is DCPS does have a responsibility to serve this, whoever comes in the city. And that's not mentioned at the same time as we mention the capital. So that would be my part of what I'd like to see discussed as we drive into these cost drivers.
Question for Kathy. Could you explain what you mean by unlimited supply?
Well, we have right now, we can open up, you know, the charters can open up to 10 new schools a year. DCPS chooses to open up new selective schools. So we open up a lot of schools, and we call demand if anybody wants to go to them versus do we need new schools? Do we need to have, you know, what's our base to serve the children of the District of Columbia? So what I mean by unlimited supply is we consistently open up new schools without regard to whether we need them in terms of the space we already have. Does that make sense, Ryan? To you, am I making myself understood?
Well, I do. I guess my question is, if new schools are opening and people are attending them, are you arguing that there should not be schools opened that people want to attend?
In a way, I am. I'm saying then why don't we look at what they want and kind of look at the programs we're offering in our current schools instead of saying that if a person, an individual's desire to go to another school is our highest value, instead of us as a city stepping back and saying, what do we actually need to best serve the children of the city as a group? What do we have the money to do? How can we really spend well on all of them and make sure we're serving all of them? So yeah, I don't think desire, an individual family's desire, should be the highest driving principle. I think it should be in there, and we should be listening to what programs we might need to put into the existing schools, instead of, if a person has a good idea that they think people might come to, that then they open up a new school.
Yep, I think we have to move from this. I think the important thing that is being acknowledged here, Kathy, and I'm glad you bring it up, is that there are different responsibilities for what DCPS is expected to provide as the system of right, and that's something that I think might not be as explicitly apparent for a brand new viewer of this kind of study. So I think that that's an important point, and that there are just different kinds of costs that we see across the two sectors, and that they're addressed in different ways too. So when we're thinking about access to capital dollars on the DCPS side and access to the facilities allotment on the charter side, whether those things are comparable or fair, I think these are conversations that we have more broadly at the city level really frequently. And I think that that we should try to get through some of the rest of this, but I do want to make sure that we acknowledge those things, and I appreciate you bringing it up. Okay, if we could, Lindsay, if you wouldn't mind jumping, the next little bit is on enrollment analysis. So I think we can actually skip that. Just shows the mix of charters and DCPS over time. If you could go to slide 16. So most of these, we went over those kind of headlines, the 1, 2, 3, 4 on slides 5 and 6. Most of this is just going to be graphically presented. So I just want to make sure you know that these are resources that are available within the study itself. Again, we look at it from the city level, and then we take a look at any meaningful differences between DCPS and PCS that we saw from the expenditure study. So again, this is just the headline that from the city perspective, when you're looking at these 5 LEAs, the CAGR about 4.1%, an increase to just under $22,500 per pupil in fiscal year 19. Next slide. This is that mix of personnel and non-personnel that we saw in the headline there, just presented graphically here. We know that there is a difference between what we saw in the expenditure data from DCPS and charters, and we'll take a look at that in a moment. Next slide. Average teacher salary increasing. We saw that it's increasing at similar rates on the charter side and DCPS side. We'll see that graphically in a moment too. But what we see here, about just under 70K in fiscal year 16, up to just over 80K in fiscal year 19. Next slide. And then this is an acknowledgement of taking the same kind of analysis toward the foundation level. So for anyone that stares at the UPSFF shelves like I do all the time, these numbers will look pretty familiar. These are the foundation levels from fiscal year 16 to fiscal year 19, and taking a look at what the growth rate there would be. I do want to acknowledge that this isn't the growth rate of the allocation total to the sectors, because the foundation level flows through the whole formula, but this shows the increases over time as you're considering moving from fiscal year 16 to fiscal year 19 in the foundation level. All right, next slide. Great, and now we're going to, as we just looked at the city level, now we're going to take a look at the DCPS versus the charter level. Again, this is just taking a look at what the CAGR is for DCPS versus public charter schools on the next slide. So you see those same numbers, about 21,000 on the DCPS side, 23,800 on the charter side here in fiscal year 19. Those correlate right up with that slide 5 that had this headline. I think the notice here, Lindsay, actually, if you'll jump back just one slide again, is personnel is the big cost driver over on the right-hand graph, right? Fiscal year 17 was the first year of the retroactive WTU agreement, so we would expect to see quite a big driver of teacher costs on the DCPS side. And we also see increases on the teacher side on slide 21, but hitting a little bit later for the sample charters that we took a look at their expenditure data for. All right, slide 22, which is a title slide. So if we go to slide 23. And so again, this is this is taking a look now, that should say DCPS on the left and charters on the right. We had taken a look at the mix of personnel and non-personnel. It's about 75-25. This is the difference between the charter side and the charter side on the right and DCPS on the left. Of course, this rent, debt service, depreciation, those are costs that DCPS does not directly incur, the charters do. So if we want a more apples to apples comparison, we would move to the next slide. And this is where we get that 80-20 split, personnel, non-personnel on the DCPS side on the left, and the 70-30 personnel, non-personnel split on the right for the charters that we looked at their expenditure data for.
I know that the report in a couple of different places does acknowledge that charters contract out for certain services that DCPS has in-house. And I appreciate it makes that point. As someone who's involved in that, it's readily apparent to me. I'm not sure if it's stated clearly enough. The economies of scale that DCPS has to have, whether it's one occupational therapist who can go to 3 different schools is not realistic for a charter with one school who has to then contract by time. And if there's a way to show this same chart that includes the contracted direct student services that charter schools have for personnel, I think it would give a clearer representation.
Got it. Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. I think there is indication later on in the NPS analysis of that, but I want to make sure that we cover that too. So I appreciate bringing that up too. Lindsay, if you'll go to slide 25. So this just breaks it down on a per pupil basis, personnel expenditures. Again, increases for both DCPS and charters. It's a little confusing here because the bars are about the same size, but of course the scaling is a little bit different, a little bit higher on the DCPS side per pupil than on the charter side.
And I just had one question for clarification. I was trying to figure it out from the deck, but if are there administrative costs for larger DCPS that are allocated per school?
Yep, that's in there. Yeah, so typically
allocated for administration.
Yeah, I think it would depend. I can't remember exactly how they allocated it. There's some methodology slides in here too that probably better describe it than I'd be able to do on the fly. But yes, that was included as part of the expenditure information. Slide 26, Lindsay. So now we get down to, this is personnel expenditures. And actually, Shelley, I think that this is what we were getting to. Some of this is like school-wide staff. Actually, someone from DCPS might be able to better explain this, but some school-wide staff I think might fall on like a central budget as school support, but then would be part of what Afton would have considered school-wide staff as like an itinerant teacher or those kinds of things. So we just have to take a deeper look at the methodology here. I think the headline here is that for DCPS and charters, which we see on the next slide, it's about 50% classroom teachers. And then there's a little bit of variation dependent upon the other categories: school-wide staff, administration, central management, et cetera. So Lindsay, if you'll just show slide 27, which is the charter version of this. Yep, great, thank you. So just about half, again, if you look at that classroom staff teachers line, the bottom line, going toward that set of folks. School-wide staff are folks like counselors, coaches, those other kind of support positions that help, not necessarily directly teaching, but are supporting the school community and students' needs more broadly. All right, and Lindsay, we're going to jump down to slide 31, please. For some of this per pupil expenditure information. So slide 31, again, average teacher salary, we see increasing at similar rates. Of course, on the DCPS side, a little bit higher just in terms of the dollar amount. When compared to the charter side, but interesting to see that the growth rates were about the same as in this analysis when you looked at DCPS on the left and charters on the right.
Can I ask a quick question, Kevin? And maybe there's not a quick answer, but there's a lot of detail, so it appears that a lot of things were considered, but there are still all these things around the edges that clearly are distinct. When calculating benefits, pension contributions or retirement fund contributions, does this reflect contributions that are later forfeited if someone leaves and doesn't vest, or is it just showing what the contribution is each year without netting that out?
I think that would depend on how it would show up in the expenditure information. And that might vary. I'm not sure specifically about that.
It seems like something that would be budgeted at a certain amount as a percentage of salary or other things, and I'm just curious whether it gets netted out or if it's tracked at the end of the year as a net figure, because I think that's an important component if it's not being captured.
Got it. I'm not sure about the exact answer. Justin?
Yeah, Jonathan, I was just going to respond to that question. I think that on an actual basis, that gets adjusted in the following year. So if you have, teachers who leave at the end of the school year, those forfeitures are going to come back as a credit in the following year when you're making those contributions to your 403B provider. So if you're an organization that has a pretty stable employee count, that the timing difference should net itself out year over year, or the difference shouldn't be too material, but that's at least how it works on our side. So it is accounted for. It's just there's a 1 year lag.
Okay, thank you.
Lindsay, if we could jump down to slide 34, please. This will just be our last little bit about non-personnel spending. Great. So this is the same slide we saw before about the split between personnel and non-personnel. We go to slide 35. Again, same slide, but this removes that rent, depreciation, and debt service from the charter side, so it looks a little bit more apples to apples. We're able to compare because those costs are not incurred by DCPS. Next slide. So what we did see in this conversation about non-personnel spending is that it's increasing over time on the DCPS side, relatively flat over time for the charters studied, which is the orange bars on the right. Next slide. And this is just breaking out DCPS. So you see where some of those increases are happening from fiscal year 16 to fiscal year 19, according to these categories listed out color-coded on the right. And then we see the same thing on slide 38. Again, relatively flat here, but we see the increases and decreases over time from fiscal year 16 to fiscal year 19 for the sample of charters that were studied. And the last little zoom here, Lindsay, if you go to slide 39. Great, and I think that this part, Jonathan, brings up the point earlier that you made about, yes, the economies of scale here, was about what DCPS is able to do just with the enrollment relative to the side of most charter networks. I think there's also just interesting things in here, acknowledge that both while the facilities allotment is a driver of non-personnel spending on the charter side that DCPS does not get for costs that they don't incur, there also is this interesting mix of direct services to students being provided out of house for charters that are otherwise provided in-house for DCPS. And that includes things like this facilities operations support or custodial services, often provided in-house by DCPS and not necessarily provided in-house by all the charters that we studied.
Hey, Kevin, 37 and 38, I guess. Would that be just the increase? Would that be somewhat, I guess, related to the whatever the 2016 contract change for teachers? Is that like a huge driver why it shifted somewhat?
I think on the personnel slides earlier, that's probably where you would more find the impact of that. These are just non-personnel, the last couple.
Got it.
Mm-hmm. All right, and then slide 40. So slide 40, I do just want to acknowledge as I zoom in on the facilities costs according to these three buckets and the facilities allotment. I do think it's important also to acknowledge that charters are not obligated to spend facilities allotment on anything specific. But what this does do is show three costs that DCPS does not incur and therefore does not receive compensation for, and how those are actually expended on the charter side among our small sample of networks. Again, something to caveat this with or acknowledge is that this isn't necessarily completely comprehensive across the charter networks. It may be true, for example, that this set of charters has access to a certain set of sophisticated debt instruments that other charters may not have. But it is something that we saw when you look at these just 3 buckets of costs, that they were decreasing certainly from fiscal 17 to fiscal 19 for this small subset. And then up against the charter facilities allotment to the right, just an acknowledgement of the imbalance there that we see over time.
Kevin, this is Chelsea. Did you look at all, were you able to look at all capital expenditures for DCPS to compare?
We didn't have that, no. The only, all that we looked at was operating on the DCPS side. So not capital, only the operating dollars. Good question. So what I think I would like to do now is to jump back up to just the title slide of this this deck, Lindsay. So slide 1, I suppose. Again, I want to acknowledge that we this I think has a lot of information, but I think that for the folks in this group, as we talked about before, this may not feel entirely relevant for how to make a recommendation or set of recommendations based on this information moving forward. So what I do want to do is have an opportunity for folks to talk about other costs, either at your LEA or with the communities that you work with that may not have been acknowledged in this kind of retrospective look of the study, to make sure we get it on the record and that we're trying to incorporate it into where the scoping of any kind of final recommendations would be from this group. So I'll open it up to anything that anybody would like to share about the rising costs for specific LEAs or the communities you work with.
This is Jack McCarthy. I'll just reference one growing need that we've identified, particularly with 3 and 4-year-olds. We actually presented, and I think many of the people here were invited to see a presentation on a very encouraging early childhood mental health consultation model that ends up costing out about $390 per child when implemented. I know that there are a variety of ways in which these costs are being factored in by the city through Department of Behavioral Health and through other places, but increasingly, I think this is something that we're all recognizing is an important part of teaching and learning. And it's something that respectfully, I would argue, might be considered as part of the foundation going forward, since it's certainly something that will become more and more of an issue, and the city will be trying to think in terms of ways to factor this in to improve teaching and learning, particularly for our most at-risk students.
Thanks, Jack. And Jack, in that, are you suggesting that it should be built into the foundation level or that it should be built into the weight for 3 and 4-year-olds?
I think either. I think that there are different ways in which this can be delivered at different ages. And so that's why I think I would tend to build it into the foundation level, because I think it's something that is important. I think everyone who's operating, whether it's a District of Columbia public school or a public charter school, increasingly we're recognizing that it ends up being sort of a core part of what we're doing with teaching and learning. There are some that are more expensive to deliver based on size and so forth, and you could build it into the weightings, but I would just build it into the foundation.
Got it. Thanks. Others?
I don't have the details on this, and I'll get them, but I think the facility costs for DCPS, the sense I have is that they don't get completely covered, even though we're looking at expenditures. So I'd like to have that I'll get more information on that. And I imagine that might be partly true for the charters too. I don't know, but I know that the complicated thing we have between DGS and the maintenance and the way things get done, it's frustrating, and it doesn't seem like there's always enough allocated, or at least it doesn't get done. But I don't think we're hitting the same feeling that we talked about with the ELL. I'm not sure we're hitting the whole universe of what we need to hit. And I see, I know the capital budget is in there, but then as we talk about that, we need to talk about the responsibility. And if we talk about expenses, and we're assuming in this that we're looking at federal and local dollars, but we're not looking at all the other dollars that come in to different systems or at our whole system. So I just put that out there. I mean, we have Jessica and Elba, but I think there are other expenses that DCPS schools have that we could talk about.
Yeah, Kathy, I think, are you just talking about we send about $30 to $40 million a year to DGS for facilities maintenance, like includes rent and electricity and so forth, right? So that does come out of our UPSFF base funding, that building maintenance cost. And it is a significant cost that our DGS counterparts set. So that is something that is kind of a nuance in this conversation.
Yes, I think that's not mentioned, as if we just have this huge pot of money, we can cover everything. Yes, thank you, Jessica. That's not noted here.
Great. Ryan, if we could do our second public comment period, and of course we can also have working group members contribute throughout this as well.
Just one other thought, I think, the same lines, Kathy. I think there's a nuance on the slide 40. You want to flip there about how the facilities fee is not required to be used on certain expenditure categories. I think that's another nuance just to raise up in this, that it is a pretty nuanced conversation.
Yeah.
Okay, so if there's anybody in the public members that want to provide any comment, you can use the raise your hand feature. And not seeing anything.
Okay. Go ahead, Kathy.
I just wondered if people weren't able to come to this to offer public comment, are there other ways that the public can offer comment on this section?
Yeah, I think that we'll continue. So we're going to be finished covering the chapters themselves, so like literally walking through slides. But I think the remaining meeting or meetings in December will be acknowledging all of the material that we've covered so far. So not just at risk, which I hope we can get pretty far along with our remaining time today, but the foundation level we'll certainly acknowledge in the next meeting too. And they could join for the public then. And I think, Ryan, that they can register right on the website, right?
They can register to provide comment?
Mm-hmm. To join the meeting as a public member. Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you.
Great, and that actually was a great segue, Kathy. So I think to cover our final section for today, what I'd like to do is bring up the draft at-risk student need and at-risk concentration recommendations that we had sent earlier to you all. I think as folks that were on this 2018 group will remember, we will spend the majority of our time, now that we're done finishing new content, we'll spend the majority of our time just trying to hammer out language that the group is comfortable with moving forward in these recommendations, which will be a part of this final report that will go to council early 2021. So we have some work to do, but I think what we've done so far, the facilitation team, is taken all of the information from the meetings inputs, the survey inputs, the study itself, other kinds of areas that we could try and capture what we think are the starting points of recommendations from the group. But I do want to walk us through a little bit of a procedure here to talk about the language, see what folks agree with, disagree with, want to reorder, change around. And also want to acknowledge before we jump in, of course, we're only looking at at-risk and at-risk concentration for right now because we didn't have all of the inputs yet for L in the foundation level. But something I've heard very clearly from this group is considering these things as a whole. So something to keep in your mind as we're going through the different recommendations here is how this will interact with other recommendations that we might put forth from the working group as it has to do with L or with the foundation level or something else that is not as neatly bucketed into those things. So I think the way that we'll do this, I'll just talk structurally about each one. We'll focus first on at-risk student need, then we'll talk about at-risk concentration, which they reference each other, but I want to make sure that we have a focused conversation on this. And so first we'll look at this at-risk student need section. As you know, there were lots of options that were in the study. What we tried to do in this first recommendation, recommendation 1, was just put down where about the group seemed to be feeling about each of them, which is that there were a couple in this first line, the 2+ group and the overage in high school group that seemed to have the most support from the working group. And then if you look at 1C, that's sort of everybody else that had some kind of support. So those were students like CFSA students, high school at-risk students also had some middle supports, which I would call second-tier support. And then 1D is more about students that we thought should not be prioritized for additional funding relative to other students that the group would like to prioritize. So that was the 3+ group. There's a very small amount of students, as you'll remember, and then just broadly increasing the high school weight. So that's 1 and 1C and 1D. And of course, the other big note that we've heard from the group is that incremental funding is preferable to distributed funding. So we should look closely at this 1A, which makes that explicit note, and 1B, which I think starts to get to this conversation about this being a holistic exercise. Like maybe we as a group decide or you as a group rather, decide that you would like to see an increase in the at-risk weight and would be okay with the trade-off of a lower increase in the foundation level. Again, taking a look at the holistic measure of this. And then finally, too, the other big notes that we have, recommendation 2 is about the at-risk definition and making sure that we're capturing all the students that you would like to see captured there. And recommendation 3, which is this one group that we seem to need more information on, which are students that become overage prior to high school. We know about students that are overage in high school because they're captured in the at-risk weight. This would instead seek further information on students that become overage prior to high school and what supports we can provide them that would be helpful in either preventing their overageness or just supporting them through their academic career. So I will pause there. I want to just open it up broadly to conversation, which I think will lead us to some interesting places. And I also have some questions if we need some conversation starters too. So just recommendations 1 through 3, which are the average student need ones for right now. We'll talk about concentration in just a second.
I guess, sorry, this is Raymond. So for 3, and maybe I'm interpreting this wrong, but I guess what I worry about with 3 is that this seems like and I wasn't on the previous groups, but it seems like an extension of previous groups and another study to look into this later on, right? And so there's no to be done by when, right? Like, because this can be another 15-year process.
So you'd like to see it more, number 3, be more time bound?
And like accelerated time bound in my mind, but that's just, I'm probably biased.
Got it. Good note. Lindsay, would you mind? I don't know if you're able to. Can you zoom? I don't know if anyone else is having trouble seeing the
Yes, I'll look.
text. I see faces moving toward the screen. There we go. That's great. Thank you.
I think it's hard, Kevin, without having any money attached to anything, for us to kind of weigh what the cost relative to other things or So our recommendation is kind of outside the consideration of how much money we're directing to these things and what it could possibly do. So at some point, are we going to get to that?
So I think that, yeah, I think that the way that these are crafted right now would be to say, not putting a specific amount toward something. We know the relative sizes. If you look at the kind of cost slides, each of the chapters, we know how big the population might be if you increase each relative rate by 10%, for example. But the way that this is crafted right now would be, we prefer incremental funding, however much is available, we'll put it toward these things. Now, if we do have a prescriptive, like we think that another $1,000 per student should go toward students that are 2+ characteristics, I think that we should include that. But I don't think that we have the information to be able to, at this point, to be able to tie a specific number like that to it.
I get that. I think it might be helpful for us. I feel a little, if we say incremental funding, if it's available, I think if I were them, I'd say, well, there's nothing available. So I think we have to tie it to, this is what, we have to kind of be in a bargaining position where we'd say, these are tight times, but this is what's needed of this. Let's kind of work on what we can get instead of leaving it just open to whatever's available. I mean, I think that would be important as we look at all of these together. Because part of what we struggled with in the at-risk is it's actually not very much money.
Right.
And so, as we look at the recommendations, it sounds like it's going to have a big impact, but it hasn't because it's not tied to any particular programs that necessarily work, and it's not that much money. Is that other people's perception also?
Yeah, I wonder, Kathleen, if this is similar to my like by when, or to what is the, if there's a financial goal, like I don't know what, like a by when over the next 2 years, like then it will eliminate the as needed part or as available part, because we can always say it's not available. If it's kind of like time bound, like over the next 3 years or whatever it is.
Yeah,
I want to add that I don't recall in any of the previous UPSFF Working Group's recommendations not actually putting a number. I think we've always come up with some kind of measurement. So to me, this strikes me like Kathy as strange that we would say, here's what we would in an ideal scenario see happen, but we're not gonna say more about the amounts. I think we have to say something, and I think that something that has been sort of an underlying tone through many of these conversations is this restriction, right? This notion that we are restricted by what's feasible by the District of Columbia. And I really caution us to limit our recommendations based on these restrictions, because every time we really don't know, right? We really don't know where all this is going to land. And our job is to say, here's what we schools need. And then the district will have to figure out whether they can do it or not, or to what extent they can do it. But I think for us to right off the bat in our first set of recommendations, to not get specific and to not make a recommendation, not based on only the restrictions of the district, but based on the data that we've reviewed, on the information that we have, and based on that data, limited as it may be, make the best recommendation possible. But I feel strongly with Kathy that we need to say something. We can't just say based on what's available.
What else, Kevin? I think we have to, the people reading this haven't looked at all the data and examined what the need is. And so there's nothing that prefaced why this is really important, why these students really don't make it. And why we're saying that these overage high school students, they drop off the map after high school. We haven't served them in both sectors if we don't have the resources to kind of help them make up or whatever, but if there's just nothing that actually makes it compelling to actually do it. So I know this is just the draft, we're just talking about it, but I feel like as a group, we're going to have to make it compelling when we come up with our final recommendations. Why?
Yes.
I don't repeat myself.
And I think as with the way that I think we're planning on this is, as with the 2018 report, the whole first 10 pages is everything that's covered in the group, right? So this would be referencing back to the study. This would show why these are compelling groups to think about. This would show all the options that were presented. So I think this is right now missing a lot of context to what you're describing. So I think that that's totally right. I think that we will have all of that in the final report. I think that this language then will not be as decontextualized as you're seeing it here, but I do also acknowledge that there might be changes that need to be made to make it more compelling from the view of the group. And I think that what I want to try to drive to is to see, I think, for example, a time-bound suggestion, I think would be helpful to like the next draft to say like we should put in by X date, we should have this. I think it's harder to know, like, perhaps it's just as easy as striking the phrase available over time, which seems to be to give an option rather than to say like we need the new funding and it should be this much, right? So I think that there are different ways that we could approach this and open to whatever the feedback of the group is. I mean, I think the challenge here though too is like getting to a number that everyone is going to feel good about, because we don't have it, right?
Yeah, and Kevin, if what that number would be based on. I mean, that's I think we've been trying to provide with the studies basis and analysis to help. And so I think that's if there is a push to drive to a number, what would we want that based on?
I vaguely remember that I've looked at numbers from other jurisdictions and we had examples. Like at one point there were numbers on the table just based on other jurisdictions, not necessarily going all the way to here's potential numbers for DC, but I thought there were specific weights and specific ideas that were looked at that could ground us on that.
Yeah, I'm thinking of the L side. I remember there being like, this is what the different weights and all of those pieces were. I think because our at-risk definition is so unique relative to other places, I don't know that they had that kind of analysis here. But what they do have is those cost slides that does show, you know, if you were to increase it by 10%, this is how many students would be affected. This is how much it would cost. Like maybe it is going back into the chapter itself and saying, if this is the amount that we would like to see it increase by 50%, you multiply it by 5, and that dollar amount is about X, right? And then we say we want to put this amount of funding toward that thing. I think this might just be partially going back into the kind of deeper slides that we went over, you know, long ago at this point, but to find a basis to Jen's point.
I think the other thing too, Kevin and group, I think the other thing I just want to flag, I hear from a few of you saying it's unsatisfactory or unsatisfying essentially to leave it open without a dollar amount. And to Vanessa, to your point, to not limit ourselves preemptively. But I also think it seems like we should be cognizant and be a little tone deaf in these times to pie in the sky as well. So I feel like there is I think there is a balance. I hear you that there should be a dollar amount. I still caution on what it would be based on as opposed to just arbitrary. And I also want to caution us in not being tone deaf in these times.
I understand that we don't want to be arbitrary, but I think, you know, at the beginning, Kevin, you cited the time we're in right now. And in a way, so now we have greater gaps in education. You know, we've had kids distance learning, we've had all the costs of distance learning, and we've had trauma. We've had all these factors that point to a rise in education costs going forward, whatever our money is. And we'll have to look. I mean, I guess we're going to have to ground that with something, but it's there. You know, it's going to cost more to make up the difference of what we've lost. And so I think in the month that we have before we have to hand this in, we have to find a way to talk about that and put the urgency that's there because of that. And, you know, I don't have my thoughts all together on what that looks like or how we put a dollar amount on it, but it's kind of foundational to what we're putting out. I think it's going to be really, you know, the first 10 pages or whatever, we've had all this discussion. We had a lot of it before we even realize how things are. We don't even know who the president's going to be at this point. So we're really in a tough place, but we have to we have to park this in our current reality.
Yeah, I agree with both statements that we can't be pie in the sky. I get that, and I agree with that. And I definitely agree that at the end of the day, that will be the political calculus, right, Kathy? Like, at the end of the day, the powers that be need to come to the realization that we are at a time where our children are most at risk and that they're being traumatized, and that it's going to take resources for schools to be able to support them, however, whatever that looks like in 2021. So I think we have to strike that balance at the best that we can, but I think you're right. I think that needs to be part of this. I also want to make sure we're reading Jack's comments on the chat, because I think this is a point that was discussed earlier in our conversations, and it's something that I think we should say something about in our report as well, in our recommendation. And that is going back to this notion of striking the right balance between flexibility for schools and reporting, right? Like, I don't have as much of a problem reporting how we spend our dollars. I do have a problem if the legislation reads something around, allowable expenditures, or, some kind of performance requirement as a result of spending these dollars. Like, that is something that, whether it's for at-risk or for ELS or for SPED or for pre-K or for whatever, that should never enter into the UPSFF recommendations, right? Like, we have to hold the line on, yes, we need more money for at-risk. Yes, we understand transparency and the need to report. Reporting is one thing. Eligibility of how you spend funding and what happens to those dollars and the performance of it is a whole nother bag of chips that we don't have anywhere in the SFF, and we should not allow it to be part of the at-risk increased funding either. So I want to make sure we address that chat comment from Jack.
Yeah, I guess just to add some voice to this, I think we're all well-intended, and we're looking at the political realities and trying to do the best we can and trying to be flexible. But when it comes time to think about accountability and what we're doing in exchange for the public dollars, these senses are not always part of that oversight process. And I think that it's reasonable when someone's conducting oversight to say, well, gee, you're getting this extra money for this amount, and what are you doing? And I think it's very difficult for most schools to actually break out incremental money that isn't enough to actually make the difference, which I think we've seen in all the consulting reports, and then to make a legitimate argument as to the difference that it's making. And so that's why I'm from my perspective, and I'm just one voice, I've never understood why we've continued to do this, as opposed to perhaps just recognizing that this is an important, element of teaching and learning and building this into the foundation.
Other thoughts?
If I can move to number 2 and number 3, I just want to acknowledge Jonathan's chat on number 2, because number 2 was not clear to me what we were trying to say there. And I think Jonathan has given us a little more language to try to further clarify what we're trying to get at with number 2. And then number 3, I'm trying to figure out, is it because we don't have the time to look at the data, or is it because we don't have the data on overaged and grade level? Because this was, if I recall, came through our conversations about before high school. Can we look at data before the kids get to high school?
Yeah, I think for number 3, which is like, we know the counts there. So we know about how many students are that are over age before high school. So what that means is that those students enter high school already over age, right? And then there's this other group that they might not be overage when they're in 8th grade, but then they become overage throughout their high school career too. And maybe there is meaningful difference between those two groups in the ways that we would consider supporting them. I think that is a much more nuanced conversation for any information that we currently have. So it could be true, for example, that there is some kind of predictive analysis that could be done to say that a student that meets this set of criteria is likely to become overage for school and therefore needs these kind of supports to not become overage in that time period, right? Especially because we know that the outcomes for students once they are overage are so poor. So how can we try and build in this kind of preventative set of interventions that would help to prevent this? We just simply don't know enough about this group to know what would work for them or what would even predict whether they become overage early or whether they become overage in high school. So that's what that number 3 is trying to get at. I think number 2 is yep, go ahead. Sorry, Vanessa.
No, I was going to say that's helpful. My wondering is, I think that there have been some really important voices around this conversation that I want to make sure we don't lose, which is that we already have students who are overaged for their grade levels, and it's less about the predictive part that you described, which is definitely a good, like, aspirational, like we should be looking at that. But from a right now, if you look at our population of students right now in elementary and middle school, and I'm going to make a huge assumption that potentially more middle school than elementary school, you probably already have students who are overaged based on the grades they should be for a variety of reasons. And that's just a raw data set that OSSE, I'm also making an assumption, has. And so if the recommendation is that we study that better because we're thinking about this more aspirational, like predictive methodology that does get into things like interventions, as opposed to a straight up number of students in grades based on their dates of birth, who's overaged and based on their grade levels, and that can maybe tell us more about, like, is this underaged, no, overaged, undercredited, not using the word credited for middle school and elementary school, a problem that goes beyond high school. And by that, I don't mean that futurely could potentially happen, but that's currently happening in the district right now. That's the part that I thought we were trying to suss out when we were having that conversation, is how many of our students are currently in grades where they are behind already. And even before we get to the second part about they could be behind in high school.
Yeah, it's definitely both. The intent of this is both. And I think we shared last time, it's something like between 12 and 15% of each middle school grade is already overage if you apply the methodology that we use for high school grades. So the thing that I think is interesting in that is that those students might have a different set of needs. They're already going to be overage, right? They're not becoming not overage unless they're going to skip a grade, right? So they may have a different set of needs than students who become overage in high school. Again, we just don't know the nuance between those two groups because we just talk about all students as if they're overage or becoming overage. So there's just a little bit of in there, but yes, I think it's a both conversation. And to make this clearer, I would love any suggestions for that, because I think that this is illustrating the kind of challenge that we have talking about these groups too.
So maybe to the earlier point that I think Kathy or somebody else, or maybe it was Raymond who made, like, maybe it's the way we're writing these, like maybe we need to start with a statement, right? Like, I'm going to give you the example for number 3, right? Like, current data shows blah, right? It's very limited data. It's just one data point, right? Because of that, right, we think that we should further study blah, right? Like, I think maybe it's about giving a one-sentence primer as to the why in a very succinct way so that anybody who reads this has a little bit of context. What's the statement? Why is that the issue? And I think just saying we would like to do further study of X without having that statement is what gets lost a little bit.
Yeah, that is a great point. Agreed. I think it gets to that conversation, Kathy, that we were having just now too about the contextualization of this. Like right now, it's just not contextualized. So, but I think, Vanessa, to your point, folks are most likely to just go to the recommendation section.
That's right.
Right. So we need to make sure that they can look at it and understand it.
You're not going to read the 10 pages. So we got to weave it in.
I understand. Yes, agreed. Right. Okay, I think we've gotten a lot of feedback on this. Of course, I do want to, we won't move completely away from it. I do just want to hit at-risk concentration before we open to public comment and end today. I do also want to say, even though we have these meetings infrequently, please feel free to email me if you're having, if you have a thought bubble come up that it would be really helpful for wording or phrasing. Lindsay and Ryan and I will be happy to take that and incorporate it for the next round before we get out to the working group again. For at-risk concentration, this one's a little bit more straightforward just because there were fewer options and it references back up to the at-risk student need. The kind of input that we've heard so far, both from the survey data and just conversations here, is that the group would prefer to focus on the average student need section, so those student level characteristics, before implementing something like a school level concentration. So it doesn't mean that we don't acknowledge that, as it says in 4C, that, or 4C1, that this could be something that would be worthwhile. Actually, Lindsay, can you zoom down, or sorry, scroll down just a little bit because it's getting cut off. I think because of the page difference. There we go. Up just a little bit. There we go. So acknowledging that this is highly correlated, as we saw in that chapter of the study, but essentially what this is showing is we have a couple of options. These are the ones the group doesn't like. These are the ones the group would like. We'd prefer to do something with the at-risk weight itself, but we acknowledge that this is something that could have impact on students, particularly at multi-campus LEAs. We're thinking about it from their own school funding perspective as well, not necessarily from the UPSFF, but something that we acknowledge is important. And all of the issues that we talked about with contextualization above apply here. So I think that we'll be sure to incorporate more of that as part of our broad feedback from today. But I do just want to open it up to conversations about whether this feels right in terms of the prioritization of the previous recommendations relative to this, and any other kinds of conversation we want to have about at-risk concentration.
Karen, this is small in semantics more than anything. But I think one piece, and I know that the beginning of this report will explain how there's discussion and review of materials and there's collection of opinions and all the rest of it, right? So when it says things like the working group does not support or does support, there was variation within it. So maybe it's something like the majority of members or some sort of, right? Because I'm reacting to like, I'm not a big fan of the school level qualification personally. I might have been outvoted, right? So I'm just having some individual reactions. So it may, and this is obviously will be updated. I'm assuming we're going to have some, I think you mentioned before.
Iteration,
right?
yeah.
Iteration of it. So this is just small, this is small semantics, but it might make a difference for people like me.
Yeah, I think it's an important point, Jen, too, which is like, as we saw from even those temperature check, preliminary data, we really had some pretty big divergence. So it may be true that each individual working group member doesn't see exactly what they would have ranked or preferred in all of the pieces. But I want to feel like when we put this forth as a body of work, that everyone feels pretty good about where we landed in terms of the broad understanding about where the group was landing on those things. So I appreciate you acknowledging that too. And I think that there are ways we could tweak the language to make sure that it's more clear about the kind of level of support across many working group members or a majority of working group members, or that kind of contextualization too. Okay, seems like folks need a little bit of time to reflect on it. What I do want to do just to make sure we get it in is to make sure we acknowledge in the public. So Ryan, if we could do our final public comment period for anyone that has comments about any of the recommendations we've talked about today.
Sure. So if anybody in the public wants to make a public comment, you can use the raise your hand feature and I can unmute you. Okay, Mary, I am going to unmute you. Can you please just say your name and then your comments.
Yeah, hi everybody. This is Mary Filardo of the 21st Century School Fund. And I just wanted to get on the record associated with cost drivers that it seems that there's a lot at the micro level, but really a major cost driver is just opening new schools, whether it's DCPS or public charter schools, and increasing the number of LEAs. Those bring with them tremendous costs. You can see it in administrative costs, the percent of administrative costs, but you can also obviously see it in facilities. So I just think that's really important to have on the record, because if you only look at it from a micro school perspective, I think you're missing a very big driver of education costs in the district. So thank you.
Thanks, Mary. Anyone else, Ryan?
Yeah, if there's anybody else, you can use the raise your hand feature.
And then, of course, working group members, I think, as we're waiting for folks in the public that would like to contribute, I think I would just open up the floor more generally for any kind of feedback, particularly on this recommendation section, but really any kind of last other pieces that you would like on the record before we break for the evening. We'll do a small closing beforehand.
I don't see any other hands, so you can go on.
Great. So any other final working group contributions for the day for any of these sections that we've covered? Hearing none. Okay, so let's talk about some next steps. So for everyone's awareness, the next formal working group meeting is December 3rd. Prior to that, as I mentioned, please feel free to email me, Ryan, and Lindsay if you tomorrow think of something that you would like to have considered for recommendations. What we're going to do, similar to how we've already taken your inputs from other parts and other meetings that we've done, we're going to take the information that we have here, do a new draft, a new iteration of these recommendations. We're also going to try and spin up some at least un-L recommendation from the group based on our input from today. And of course, given the kind of broader conversation we had about the foundation level, the current context, other kinds of cost information that we covered in the middle section of our time together today, we'll make sure that all of this is properly contextualized and bring that feedback into the next version that you see as well. Since we're not covering new content in the next meeting, the majority of the next meeting will look like this. So what I do want to make sure that everyone is prepared to do is to take a look at whatever the next draft. We'll deliver that early to folks and just be ready to discuss things that you would like to see changed or better explained. This conversation, I think, was really good today, a good precursor to that. But ultimately, we want to drive toward this recommendation language being complete in December so that we have a full report ready to go to the DC Council early in January. I will also note we have 2 meetings scheduled in December. The second one is in case we don't finish up on December 3rd. The next one is just 2 weeks right after. So the goal could be that we're going to try and get everything done on the 3rd, but we do have that kind of buffer time on the 17th, 2 weeks afterward, in case we need to iron out any final language before putting it in the final report. Anything else before we wrap for today?
Thank you.
All right, thanks, folks. I appreciate it. I'll see you all in December. Please feel free to email me if you have any other comments, questions, or any other way I can help. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.